For decades, one label was stamped on almost everything we owned: made in China. The world's workshop was concentrated in one country. But that is starting to change. A new label is showing up on more products, in more supply chains, and in more boardroom conversations: made in Vietnam. So the real question is not just whether Vietnam is growing. It clearly is. The deeper question is this: does Vietnam really have what it takes to become the new world's factory? And if it does, what does that mean for your business? To answer that, we need to understand how Vietnam got here, why global companies are moving in, and why the country's biggest opportunities are now colliding with its biggest constraints. To understand Vietnam's rise, you first have to understand where it started. For much of the 20th century, Vietnam's story was defined by conflict, destruction, and poverty. By the mid-1980s, the country was in deep economic trouble, struggling with hyperinflation, shortages, and a collapsing system. Then came the turning point. In 1986, Vietnam launched a major reform program known as Doi Moi, or renovation. This was Vietnam's opening to the world. The country began moving away from a rigid, centrally planned economy and toward a more market-oriented one. Private business was gradually allowed to grow. Foreign investment was encouraged, and Vietnam began integrating itself into the global economy. What followed was one of the most remarkable economic turnarounds in modern history. Millions were lifted out of poverty. Growth accelerated. Factories expanded. And over time, rice fields gave way to industrial parks. This was not just a post-war recovery. It was an economic transformation. And eventually global companies stopped seeing Vietnam as just a low-cost frontier. They began to see it as a serious manufacturing platform. So why did the money start pouring in? Why Vietnam? The answer is a mix of policy, timing, geography, and cost. First, Vietnam has been aggressively pro-trade. The country has signed a long list of free trade agreements, giving it preferential access to major export markets. Two of the most important are the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, and the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, known as the EVFTA. These deals matter because they reduce tariffs and make Vietnam a more attractive export base for firms selling into Europe, Japan, Canada, and other major economies. Second, Vietnam has benefited enormously from the China Plus One strategy. For years, many companies concentrated too much of their production in China. But rising labor costs, geopolitical tensions, and the US-China trade war forced a rethink. They did not necessarily want to leave China completely, but they did want a backup plan. Vietnam became one of the leading answers. It offered lower wages, a strategic location next to China, improving trade access, and a government eager to attract global manufacturing. Third, Vietnam has a relatively young workforce. That gives it a major demographic advantage at a time when many countries in Asia are aging. And finally, the strongest evidence is practical, not theoretical. Some of the world's largest brands are already deeply embedded there. Samsung has invested heavily in Vietnam and produces a large share of its smartphones there. Nike now makes a majority of its footwear in the country. Adidas also relies on Vietnam as one of its top manufacturing hubs. That is not a coincidence. It is a sign that Vietnam has become a real part of how the global economy now makes things. But this is where the story gets more serious, because the question is no longer whether Vietnam can attract investment. It clearly can. The real question now is whether Vietnam can handle the scale of investment it has already won. And that is where the limits start to show. The first major problem is the supplier network. China's biggest advantage is not just scale, it is industrial depth. In China, suppliers, parts makers, logistics firms, and specialized manufacturers are often clustered together in dense industrial ecosystems. That makes production faster, cheaper, and more flexible. Vietnam does not yet have that same depth. Many factories in Vietnam still rely on imported inputs, including higher value parts that often come from China itself. That creates vulnerability and makes it harder to localize production fully. The second problem is labor quality. Vietnam has a large workforce, but as manufacturing becomes more advanced, companies need more engineers, technicians, managers, and skilled industrial workers. And that supply is not keeping pace with demand. That is creating a growing skills gap, and it is also pushing wages higher. In other words, the low-cost advantage that helped put Vietnam on the map is still real, but it is not unlimited. Then there's infrastructure. Vietnam's success is now putting pressure on its own roads, ports, and power system. Logistics bottlenecks remain a real issue. Port congestion can slow exports. Transport networks are improving, but not always fast enough for the scale of industrial growth Vietnam is now trying to support. And the energy question may be the most serious of all. For manufacturers, cheap labor means little if the power supply is unstable. Vietnam has already faced power shortages, and that raises a bigger concern for investors. Can the country reliably support the energy demands of a more advanced industrial economy? And then there is bureaucracy. Vietnam has made progress, but businesses still face administrative delays, overlapping approvals, and regulatory friction. Even anti-corruption campaigns, while important in the long run, can sometimes slow decision-making in the short term. So no, this is not a simple story of easy success. Vietnam has momentum, but it also has bottlenecks. So what is the real answer? Is Vietnam the new world's factory? Not in the sense of replacing China completely. China's scale, infrastructure, supplier network, and industrial maturity are still in a different league. Vietnam is not a one-for-one substitute for China. But that does not mean the story ends there, because Vietnam has already secured something extremely important. It has become one of the leading pillars of the global China Plus One strategy. That means it is no longer just a low-cost alternative. It is now a permanent and strategically important part of the global manufacturing map. And for businesses, that creates a real opportunity. Vietnam offers lower operating costs, trade advantages, and a way to diversify supply chains away from over-dependence on China. But success there requires realism. You cannot simply copy and paste a China strategy into Vietnam and expect it to work. You need to think carefully about supplier networks, labor quality, logistics, regulation, and location inside the country itself. Because Vietnam is not one uniform manufacturing zone. Different regions offer different strengths in infrastructure, workforce, and industrial specialization. The companies that understand that will build smarter operations. The ones that do not may find that the opportunity is real, but harder to capture than it first appears. So, Vietnam's rise from war-torn poverty to manufacturing heavyweight is one of the most remarkable economic transformations of the modern era. Its ambition is clear, its momentum is real, and global companies are continuing to place serious bets on its future. But becoming a true world factory is not just about attracting investment or winning headlines. It is about whether a country can build the supplier depth, infrastructure, energy stability, and skilled workforce needed to sustain industrial power at scale. Vietnam has already proven that it can defy expectations. Now it has to prove that it can handle success. So the deeper question is not simply whether Vietnam can attract more factories. It is whether it can build the industrial foundation to become not just an alternative to China, but one of the defining manufacturing powers of the next global era. Do you think Vietnam can overcome its infrastructure and labor constraints strongly enough to rival China in the long run? Or will it remain a critical but limited part of the global manufacturing shift? Thank you for staying with the analysis. If you value strategic clarity over noise, subscribe to the channel for the next perspective.